October 14, 1943. 15,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. A German fighter pilot scratched his logbook with a pencil, jotting down what felt like just another routine entry. It was his 17th heavy bomber shot down, AB-17 Flying Fortress, that had spiraled toward the ground, trailing black smoke and desperation. Through the canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190, he watched the remaining fortresses struggle to stay in formation, their gunners spraying desperate streams of .50 caliber rounds into the empty sky where German fighters had been just moments before. Now, the math of aerial combat was simple and brutal. German fighters could pick their moment, strike from the sun, and escape before the bomber gunners could fight back effectively. Without fighter escorts, those American bombers were nothing more than expensive targets. 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses had crossed into German airspace that morning, trying to destroy the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. By sunset, 60 would never make it back to England. Another 17 were so badly damaged they'd be written off as soon as they landed. The Luftwaffe called it a turkey shoot. The Americans? They called it Black Thursday, the darkest day in the history of the 8th Air Force. Here's the thing, neither side knew this German triumph would be one of their last. In just 4 months, everything would change. The German fighter pilots of late 1943 had every reason to be confident. Men like Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland and Major Walter Dahl had turned intercepting American bombers into a science of destruction. They developed tactics specifically to exploit the bomber formation's weaknesses, honed through months of successful combat. The standard American combat box formation, 18 to 21 bombers arranged in a three-dimensional defensive pattern, was built on the idea that overlapping defensive fire could keep fighters away. Each B-17 was packed with 13.50 caliber machine guns, theoretically covering every angle an attacker might come from. But in practice, German pilots had found critical flaws, blind spots in the nose, limited ammunition, and most importantly, the psychological toll of non-stop attacks. Headman Heinz Knoke, leading 5/JG-11, had perfected the head-on attack that targeted the B-17's weakest defensive position. On February 26, 1943, he shot down his first heavy bomber, AB-24 Liberator named Maisie, and by October, he'd taken down 16 more. His technique was precise. Approach from directly above, dive through the formation at 400 miles per hour, fire a 2-second burst at the cockpit and engines, then pull away before the top turret gunners could track him. The numbers backed up German confidence. During the first Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission on August 17, 1943, the Luftwaffe shot down 60 bombers, 16% of the attacking force. American losses were so bad that deep penetration raids were put on hold for weeks. When they resumed with the second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, the results were even worse. 77 bombers lost or written off, over 600 airmen killed or captured in a single day. Major Gasp, group commander of TU/JG-11, came up with a company front attack, FW-190s approaching side by side, flooding the bombers' defenses with multiple targets at once. The psychological impact was devastating. American gunners faced with 8 fighters closing in at a combined speed of 600 miles per hour had just seconds to choose a target, and often they'd panic and shoot at nothing.
The root of America's vulnerability came down to simple physics.
Back in 1943, no Allied fighter had the range to escort bombers deep into Germany. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the main American escort fighter, had a combat radius of only 375 miles with drop tanks, enough to reach the German border, but no farther. The twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning could fly longer, but it had mechanical issues at high altitudes in Europe's cold. Engines would fail, controls would freeze. That meant American bombers flew the most dangerous part of their missions over the heart of Germany completely alone. German fighters would just wait beyond the range of Allied escorts, then attack with full force. Luftwaffe pilots called the point where Allied fighters turned back the golden moment. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, who claimed 206 victories before his death in October 1943, described the tactic in recorded accounts. We tracked the bomber streams on radar, figuring out exactly where their escorts would turn back. The second those little friends left, we pounced. The bombers knew what was coming. You could see them tighten their formations. That escort limitation created a deadly equation. A B-17 formation might face 4 hours of combat over enemy territory, but only 90 minutes with fighter protection. German fighters could attack, land, refuel, rearm, and attack again while the bombers were still struggling to get home. Some Luftwaffe pilots flew 3 or 4 sorties against a single raid, multiplying their effectiveness. Now, the P-51 Mustang story didn't start as an American idea. It began with a British request. Back in April 1940, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American aviation looking for more P-40 fighters. Instead, North American proposed building an entirely new fighter in just 120 days. The result was the NA-73X, which first flew on October 26, 1940, a pretty amazing feat of quick development. At first, it was powered by an Allison V1710 engine. The early Mustangs were great at low altitudes, but they struggled above 15,000 feet, exactly where bomber escort was needed. The RAF used these early versions for tactical reconnaissance and ground attack, where their long-range and low-altitude performance were useful. But the change that would turn the tide of the air war came from an unexpected partnership between American and British engineering. In April 1942, Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker flew an Allison-powered Mustang and immediately saw its potential. The airframe was fantastic, more aerodynamically clean than even the Spitfire, he realized. It just needed a better engine. Harker suggested putting the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the same 2-stage supercharged engine powering the latest Spitfires, into the Mustang. The first Merlin-powered Mustang flew in October 1942, and the results were incredible. Its top speed jumped from 390 to 440 miles per hour. More importantly, its performance above 20,000 feet went from mediocre to exceptional. Its service ceiling climbed from 31,000 to 42,000 feet. Combining American mass production with British engine technology created something neither country could have built alone. What made the P-51 be truly revolutionary wasn't just its performance, it was its range. The secret came down to 3 things: an incredibly aerodynamic laminar flow wing, an internal fuel capacity of 184 gallons, compared to the P-47's 305 gallons, but in a much lighter, more efficient airframe, and the ability to carry external drop tanks without losing too much performance. That laminar flow wing, designed by North Americans Edgar Schmud, kept air flowing smoothly much farther back along the wing than conventional designs. This cut drag by nearly 30%, which translated directly to better fuel efficiency. While a P-47 burned 100 gallons per hour in cruise flight, a P-51 only used 65 gallons at the same speed. When 75-gallon drop tanks were added to the P-51B in early 1944, its combat radius reached 650 miles. With 108-gallon tanks introduced in March 1944, that range stretched to 850 miles, enough to reach Berlin, fight for 20 minutes, and fly back to England. No other single-engine fighter in the world could match that combination of range and performance. The 354th Fighter Group, nicknamed the Pioneer Mustang Group, got the first P-51BS in November 1943. Based at Boxstead in Essex, they were technically part of the 9th Air Force, but they were immediately assigned to support the 8th Air Force's strategic bombing missions. Their commander, Colonel Kenneth Martin, had just days to train his pilots to switch from P-47s to the new fighter. Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Duncan, who later led the 353rd Fighter Group, flew one of the first orientation flights and remembered, "The second I lifted off, I knew we had something special." The Mustang handled like a sports car compared to the truck-like Thunderbolt. It was responsive, fast, and most importantly, it could fly forever. The first P-51B combat mission was on December 1, 1943, a fighter sweep over Belgium and France. The first escort mission followed on December 5 to Amiens, a relatively short-range raid. 16 P-51BS accompanied the bombers, more as a combat test than a full escort. They didn't run into any enemy fighters, but the mission proved the aircraft was good for high-altitude escort work. December 13 brought the first long-range escort mission to Kiel, 490 miles from base, something Allied fighters had never been able to do before. The psychological impact on both sides was immediate. German pilots expecting unescorted bombers over northern Germany were shocked to find aggressive American fighters deep inside Reich territory. The last week of 1943 saw more intense operations as the 8th Air Force tested the Mustang's capabilities. On December 20, P-51BS escorted bombers to Bremen, shooting down 3 German fighters without losing any of their own. The Luftwaffe, still adjusting to the new threat, kept using their old tactics, waiting for the escorts to leave. But this time, the escorts weren't leaving. At first, German pilots mistook the P-51B for the P-47 from a distance, expecting them to turn back any second. When the Mustangs kept flying east past the P-47's maximum range, confusion turned to alarm. Allied intelligence intercepted radio chatter where German controllers kept asking their pilots to confirm the fighter types and positions. They couldn't believe Allied escorts had gone that far into Germany. Major Klaus Meitisch, leading 3/JG-26, realized the strategic shift right after landing from a December 30 interception where Mustangs had chased his fighters all the way to their landing approach. He reportedly told his pilots, "The air war has completely changed. Our safe zone no longer exists." March 4, 1944. 25,000 feet above Brandenburg. Through the scattered clouds below, the sprawling city of Berlin was clearly visible. The capital of the Reich, the heart of Nazi Germany, the city Hermann Göring had sworn would never see enemy aircraft. Above it, flying in perfect formation, were 660 American heavy bombers. And surrounding them, weaving protective patterns, were dozens of single-engine fighters with American markings. That first American fighter escort to Berlin was more than a tactical win. It was a psychological blow to Germany's sense of invincibility. Colonel Donald Blakesley, leading the 4th Fighter Group, had taken his 3 squadrons of P-51BS on that historic 1,100-mile round trip. The 4th Fighter Group had gotten their P-51BS on February 28, 1944, and just 4 days later, they did what German leaders had called impossible. For the Luftwaffe pilots scrambling to intercept, the sight was unthinkable. They'd been told Allied fighters could never reach Berlin. It was too far, impossible for single-engine aircraft. But there they were, fresh and ready for a fight after flying 500 miles, while the German defenders were the ones running low on fuel just after taking off. The combat that followed was brutal. The Luftwaffe sent over 200 fighters to defend Berlin, but they weren't facing tired bomber gunners. They were up against fresh, eager Mustang pilots with altitude advantage and a better aircraft. The 4th Fighter Group alone claimed 15 victories. More importantly, many German attacks on the bombers were broken up before they could get close. For American pilots, the P-51B was a game-changer in fighter design. Captain Donald Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, who became one of the war's top Mustang aces, described his first combat in the plane. "The Mustang gave us everything we dreamed of: speed to catch any German fighter, maneuverability to dogfight with them, and range to go anywhere the bombers went." The P-51B's cockpit was cramped but well designed. The pilot sat behind an inline engine that gave great forward visibility. Unlike the P-47's radial engine, which blocked much of the view, the P-51B's canopy, and later the P-51D's bubble canopy, offered good all-around vision. Lieutenant Robert Powell of the 352nd Fighter Group remembered the physical toll. 6 hours in a Mustang meant 6 hours on oxygen above 10,000 feet. Your mouth would be dry as cotton from the oxygen, your back aching from the parachute and dinghy pack you sat on, your neck sore from constantly twisting to check for enemy fighters. But we had the ability to get the job done, and that made all the difference. The sight of Mustangs over Berlin caused an immediate crisis in the Luftwaffe High Command. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring initially refused to believe the reports, until he saw gun camera footage from German fighters clearly showing P-51s over the capital. He reportedly said, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the game was up." While that exact quote might not be fully confirmed, it captures the shock German leaders felt. The tactical consequences were devastating. Every assumption about defending the Reich had been based on the idea that German airspace beyond escort range was safe. Training fields, assembly areas, and aircraft factories had been built in central Germany specifically because they were thought to be out of fighter range. Now, American fighters could strafe airfields near Prague, fight German fighters over Munich, and escort bombers to any target in the Reich. Major Gunther Röhl, one of Germany's top aces with 275 victories, recognized the strategic shift. The Mustang didn't just extend the bomber offensive, it transformed it. We could no longer choose when and where to fight. They brought the battle to us on their terms, whenever they wanted. The Luftwaffe tried different tactical responses. They formed Sturm groups, heavily armed and armored FW-190s designed to break through fighter screens and attack bombers at close range. But these slow, bulky assault fighters were easy targets for nimble Mustangs. The Germans tried mass attacks with entire groups hitting at once, but American fighters had the numbers and performance to counter even those. February 20th to 25th, 1944, known as Big Week, showed just how much the air war had changed. The 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument against German aircraft production, with P-51s providing escort the entire time.
Over 6 days, the Americans flew 3,300 bombes sorties and 3,673 fighters sorties.
They lost 226 bombers, but they shot down over 500 German fighters. More importantly, the Luftwaffe lost pilots they couldn't replace. The American strategy had shifted from just bombing targets to actively seeking out aerial combat. General James Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, issued new orders in January 1944. Fighters were to find and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever they could, instead of staying close to the bombers. Captain John Godfrey of the 4th Fighter Group described the new aggressive tactics. We'd escort the bombers to the target, but once they dropped their payloads, we'd go looking for trouble. We'd dive to the ground, shoot up airfields, catch German fighters as they were landing or taking off. Now, the numbers of attrition were overwhelmingly in the Allies' favor. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 1,311 pilots. In February, 2,121. In March, 2,115. These losses included many experienced veteran pilots with years of combat experience, pilots Germany couldn't replace. American losses were significant, but they could be made up by massive training programs that produced 11,000 new pilots every month. The P-51 was more than just a long-range fighter. It showed off American industrial and technological superiority. The K-14 computing gun sight, introduced in late 1944, gave Mustang pilots a big advantage in deflection shooting. This gyroscopic sight automatically calculated how far to lead a target based on range and turn rate, making their shots much more accurate. The Mustang's 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, while less powerful than German cannons, had more ammunition and a higher rate of fire. A P-51 carried 1,880 rounds total, enough for nearly 30 seconds of continuous fire. German fighters with cannons typically had enough ammo for less than 10 seconds. In a long dogfight, American pilots could afford to take shots. German pilots couldn't. Major Heinz Knoke, one of Germany's top aces with 220 victories, noted the difference. The Mustang wasn't just another fighter, it was a weapons system. Everything about it was optimized for its mission. We had great aircraft, but nothing that combined all the elements so well. Behind all the statistics was human tragedy on an unprecedented scale. Young men on both sides, many barely out of their teens, fought desperate battles 6 miles above the earth in temperatures of -50 degrees Fahrenheit. The lucky ones died instantly. Others suffered horrific burns, traumatic amputations from cannon shells, or slow deaths in parachutes riddled with bullet holes. Lieutenant William Wisner of the 352nd Fighter Group shot down a Bf-109 on March 8, 1944, and watched the pilot bail out. His parachute opened, but he was on fire, Wisner remembered. I could see him trying to beat out the flames on his flight suit as he fell. There was nothing anyone could do. German pilot Walter Schuck of JG-7 described how combat changed. In 1943, we were like knights of the air, jousting with bombers in something close to fair combat. By 1944, we were being chased relentlessly. Mustangs would follow us back to our airfields, circle overhead while we tried to land, then attack. There was no safe place anywhere. The psychological toll was devastating. Luftwaffe pilots who had been confident in 1943 became increasingly hopeless by mid-1944. Letters home, censored by German authorities but preserved in archives, showed deepening despair. One pilot wrote in April 1944, "We take off knowing most of us won't come back. The Americans are everywhere, always above us, always with more fuel, more ammunition." As spring turned to summer in 1944, the Mustang's range allowed for a strategic campaign that crippled the German war machine, the systematic destruction of oil production. Synthetic oil plants at Luna, Politz, and Brux, previously beyond escort range, now faced regular precision attacks with full fighter protection. The impact on the Luftwaffe was catastrophic. Aviation fuel production dropped from 175,000 tons in April 1944 to 30,000 tons in July, and just 10,000 tons in September. Training flights were cut back, then stopped entirely. New pilots arrived at combat units with as few as 50 total flight hours, compared to American pilots with 300 to 400 hours. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, commanding JG-7, described the crisis. We had the world's first operational jet fighter, the Me-262, which could fly 540 miles per hour, but we could barely fuel them for combat missions. I watched helplessly as dozens of these amazing aircraft sat idle, while Mustangs flew freely overhead. June 6, 1944, D-Day, showed just how completely air superiority had shifted. On that day, the Luftwaffe managed only 319 sorties over France, compared to 14,674 Allied sorties. Only 2 German fighters appeared over the invasion beaches. Mustangs and other Allied fighters had established such dominance that the invasion happened under an aerial umbrella with almost no challenge from German aircraft.
Oberleutnant Joseph Pipe Prier, commanding JG-26, Flouanov Dose tout sorti Wheezy Swingman, interofficier Heinz Knoke.
Making a single strafing run along Sword Beach, Priller later described the mission as suicide disguised as duty. They survived only because Allied fighters were too surprised to react to the lone pair of FW-190s. The Mustang's role went beyond escort. It became a fighter bomber. P-51 pilots got really good at train busting, destroying locomotives with their .50 caliber guns. A single Mustang could carry 2 500-pound bombs or 10 5-inch rockets in addition to its guns, making it a powerful ground attack aircraft. Captain Charles Chuck Yeager, who later broke the sound barrier, flew P-51s with the 357th Fighter Group. On October 12, 1944, he shot down 5 Bf-109s in one mission. But he also talked about the moral complexity. We went from protecting bombers to attacking anything that moved. We'd strafe trains knowing they might be carrying civilians. It was total war, and the Mustang gave us the ability to take that war anywhere in Germany. Germany's technological response came in the form of revolutionary jet fighters, the Messerschmitt Me-262 and the rocket-powered Me-163 Comet. The Me-262, which could fly 540 miles per hour, was nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51D. In the hands of experienced pilots, it could slice through bomber formations and escape before Mustangs could react. But even these technological wonders couldn't turn the tide. Adolf Galland, flying in Me-262 with JV-44 in 1945, shot down 7 aircraft but knew it was hopeless. We were like a few tigers facing hundreds of wolves. For every Me-262, the Americans had 50 Mustangs, and Mustangs could loiter over our airfields, attacking the jets when they were most vulnerable during takeoff and landing. The jet engines of 1944 to 45 were finicky, needing careful throttle control and long runways. Mustang pilots learned to exploit these weaknesses. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group shot down 2 Me-262s on October 7, 1944, by catching them in their landing pattern. The jets, low on fuel and with throttles reduced for landing, were helpless against the diving Mustangs. By early 1945, the math of air combat was impossible for Germany. The United States built 15,486 P-51s during the war, with around 8,000 serving in Europe. At its peak strength in March 1945, the 8th Air Force alone operated 14 fighter groups mostly equipped with Mustangs, over 1,000 aircraft. Against that, the Luftwaffe could put up maybe 300 to 400 usable fighters on any given day, spread across the entire Reich. Fuel shortages meant many never flew. Pilot shortages meant those that did were often teenagers with minimal training. The kill ratios showed this imbalance. By 1945, Mustang pilots were claiming 10 victories for every loss. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer, commanding the 352nd Fighter Group, ended the war with 24 aerial victories, all in Mustangs. He said, by 1945, it wasn't combat anymore, it was execution. We'd find German airfields, circle overhead, and shoot down anyone who tried to take off or land. The Mustang had turned all of Germany into a combat zone. After the war, captured Luftwaffe pilots talked openly about the Mustang's impact. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland wrote in his memoirs, "The P-51 was perhaps the most significant fighter aircraft of World War II. Until it appeared, we controlled the timing and pace of air battles over Germany. After it arrived, we never got the initiative back." Major Heinz Knoke, who survived the war with 33 victories, was more direct: the Mustang killed the Luftwaffe. Not the bomber offensive, not the invasion, that fighter that could fly to Poland and back. We went from predators to prey in 3 months. Maybe the most touching testimony came from younger pilots who entered combat late in the war. They flew their first missions with almost no training, facing experienced American pilots in better aircraft. One captured pilot said, "I flew my first combat mission in November 1944 with 55 total flight hours. On my third mission, I saw Mustangs for the first time. They were everywhere. I knew then that we had lost not just the war, but the sky itself." The Mustang's contribution went far beyond tactical wins. By allowing deep penetration raids with acceptable losses, it enabled the systematic destruction of German industry. Oil production, Germany's Achilles heel, was reduced to 10% of what they needed by March 1945. The transportation network was shattered, making it impossible to move troops, supplies, or raw materials. Aircraft production stayed high through dispersal, but it didn't matter when there was no fuel to fly the planes or trained pilots to man them. General Karl Spaatz, commanding U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, said, "The P-51 was the decisive weapon system of the European air war. It made the daylight bombing campaign possible, the invasion of Europe possible, and the systematic destruction of German military power possible." Beyond the strategic impacts were profound human changes. German pilots who entered combat in 1943 as confident warriors, if they survived, emerged as changed men. Many talked about specific moments when they knew the war was lost, almost always tied to their first encounter with Mustangs deep over Germany. Some German pilots even went from enemies to admirers. Many Luftwaffe veterans, after seeing American material superiority and humane treatment of prisoners, questioned everything they'd been told about their enemies. The gap between Nazi propaganda and reality destroyed their morale and their ideology. The P-51 was a turning point in fighter design, influencing aircraft development for decades. Its laminar flow wing showed how much drag could be reduced. Combining British engine technology with an American airframe set a model for international cooperation that continued through NATO and other alliances. The Mustang's range changed how people thought about fighter aircraft. Before the war, doctrine said fighters were short-range defense weapons. The P-51 proved fighters could be strategic weapons, projecting power hundreds of miles from base. This idea influenced everything from the F-86 Sabre in Korea to modern fighters that can deploy globally with aerial refueling. The final statistics of the Mustang's impact are staggering. 15,486 Mustangs built, 4,950 enemy aircraft destroyed in air combat over Europe, 4,131 enemy aircraft destroyed on the ground, 9,254 locomotives destroyed, over 213,873 combat sorties, more than 134,420 combat hours, and 2,520 operational losses. The kill-to-loss ratio in air combat exceeded 11-1, unprecedented in aerial warfare. But the true impact can't be measured in numbers alone. The Mustang broke the Luftwaffe's will to fight, enabled the invasion of Europe, and shortened the war by months, maybe years. The shift from German pilots laughing at unescorted bombers to complete aerial helplessness happened incredibly fast. In October 1943, the Luftwaffe controlled the skies over Germany, shooting down bombers at will. By March 1944, Mustangs were escorting bombers to Berlin. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe was combat ineffective. By April 1945, it no longer existed as a fighting force. This wasn't a gradual decline, it was a collapse. The sight of Mustangs deep over Germany triggered a chain of defeats that Germany couldn't recover from. Every lost pilot couldn't be replaced, every destroyed aircraft reduced training capacity, every successful escort mission gave Allied planners the courage to strike deeper and harder. German pilot losses tell the story. 2,967 lost in 1943, 12,037 lost in 1944, 4,238 lost between January and May 1945. Average pilot experience plummeted to over 250 flight hours before combat in 1943, 150 hours in early 1944, 80 hours in late 1944, and just 40 to 50 hours in 1945. Maybe the Mustang's greatest achievement was psychological. It shattered the myth of German technological superiority, showed American industrial strength, and proved democracy could build better weapons than dictatorship. German pilots who laughed at American bombers in 1943 were refusing to fly suicide missions against Mustang-escorted formations by 1945. Young Luftwaffe pilots indoctrinated in Nazi ideology were confused when they faced American material superiority. Everything they'd been taught about racial superiority, German technical skill, and American weakness was contradicted by that elegant, powerful fighter dominating their homeland. In 1985, 40 years after the war ended, American and German fighter pilots met at a reunion in San Antonio, Texas. Their conversations showed the Mustang's lasting impact on both sides. Colonel Clarence "Bud" Anderson, who flew 116 combat missions in Mustangs and scored 16.25 aerial victories, sat across from Oberst Gunther Roll, Germany's third highest scoring ace, and raised his glass to the P-51 Mustang, the fighter that won the air war. We had great aircraft, amazing pilots, and we were fighting over our homeland. But you had the Mustang, and that made all the difference. Walter Schuck, who switched from FW-190s to Me-262 jets, added, "We went from laughing at unescorted bombers to hiding from Mustangs in just 4 months. No military force has ever had such a complete reversal of fortune." Former Luftwaffe General Johannes Steinhoff, his face still scarred from his Me-262 crash in April 1945, reflected, "We laughed at your bombers in 1943 because we couldn't imagine America could build a fighter with a range to escort them to Berlin. The P-51 Mustang taught us the danger of underestimating an enemy. You ask when we knew the war was lost? It was that day in March 1944 when we looked up and saw Mustangs over Berlin. At that moment, every German pilot knew the truth. We had already lost." The shift from German pilots laughing at unescorted American bombers to cowering from Mustang fighters is one of the most complete reversals in military history. In less than 6 months, from October 1943 to March 1944, the Luftwaffe went from dominant to defeated, from predator to prey, from confident to doomed. The P-51 Mustang was the trigger for this change. But it represented something bigger. American industrial power, democratic cooperation between allies, and the power of technological innovation driven by necessity rather than ideology. German pilots who'd been taught American democracy made the nation weak, discovered a society capable of unprecedented unity and production. The laughter of German pilots in October 1943 was based on a reasonable assessment of technical limits. No single-engine fighter had ever flown the range needed to escort bombers from England to Berlin and back. What they didn't anticipate was American problem-solving, the successful partnership of American and British technology, and the industrial capacity to build thousands of great fighters in months, not years. When Mustangs appeared over Berlin on March 4, 1944, the laughter stopped forever. In its place was the terrible realization that everything German pilots had believed about their enemies, their own superiority, and the war's outcome was wrong. The P-51 Mustang didn't just win the air war, it shattered illusions, destroyed myths, and proved that technological superiority in war comes not from ideology, but from industrial capacity, international cooperation, and democratic innovation. The German pilots who survived never forgot that lesson. In memoirs, interviews, and reunions, they consistently pointed to the arrival of Mustangs over Germany as the moment they knew the war was lost. Not the invasion of Normandy, not the fall of Berlin, but the moment American fighters appeared where they shouldn't have been, escorting bombers to the heart of the Reich with fuel left for combat. 79 years later, the P-51 Mustang remains the ultimate symbol of American aerial supremacy in World War II. The aircraft that silenced the laughter and ended the Reich's control of its own skies. The German pilots who laughed in October 1943 learned by March 1944 that they'd laughed too soon. By May 1945, most were no longer alive to regret their premature confidence. In the end, this story teaches us the danger of underestimating an enemy, the power of industrial democracy, and the transformative impact a single weapon system can have on history. The Mustang proved that in modern industrial warfare, courage and skill, while necessary, aren't enough. Victory belongs to those who can produce the most, train the best, and innovate the fastest. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and devastating. The laughter had turned to silence, and the P-51 Mustang had written its name across the skies of Europe as the fighter that ended the Luftwaffe's dominance, and with it, Nazi Germany's hopes for victory.